Good morning and welcome to Positively Politics, the show we break down the sometimes complicated and often negative world of politics in a straightforward and academically rooted way. My name is Dr. Lara Marerfield-Wilson. I'm an associate professor of political science here at the University of Indianapolis. And whether you're listening to this on WICR 88.7 The Diamond or wherever you get your podcasts, you know that I'm about to tell you Positively Politics is all about asking the questions, inciting the conversations, bringing in data points and historical context to make sense of this political world. And I am doing a follow-up episode, if you will. The last episode, I focused on political primaries because it is political primary season after all. And I kept saying, oh, and then there are also these things called conventions. And we used to rely exclusively on conventions, and we still have conventions. And so it made sense that today I would talk about party conventions because they are still important. They do still exist. Some states utilize conventions. All states have some sort of primary, but we also have national conventions. And I wanted to talk about the history of conventions, the value of conventions, how state conventions work, and really like what conventions look like, how they compare to primaries, which I spent a lot of time talking about in the last episodes. If you missed that, you may want to catch it first. But that's what we're going to do here this morning on Positively Politics. I'm Dr. Lara Marerfield-Wilson talking about the conventional conventions and what's so unconventional about conventions right now in 2026 in American politics. So let's dive right into it. Political party conventions historically used to be the way that we nominated candidates for public office. And I go to this historical and used to because it's helpful to know that pre-primary elections, the way that parties decided who was going to represent their party was not by voters, right? The voters participate in the primaries, but it was through delegates and partisans who participated in the conventions. Now, while the process and the tasks, their objectives look different than what conventions do now, I want to highlight that the essence of a convention is still similar to what we see in 2026. Or when you think about party conventions, you're most likely in your mind going to the balloons and the signs and the big speeches and 4 or 5 days in a major American city, right? The national party conventions. These, like presidential elections, happen once every 4 years, right? The ethos is very similar, right? It's let me say like the same vibe, if you will. I'm not Gen Z, but I'm just trying to pretend to be cool here. But the idea of rallying the troops, getting people excited, hearing from the up-and-comers, the rising stars within the party, having a headliner at the national conventions, typically every night, you have your big speaker is going to be someone who's well-known, well-beloved within the political party, right? And that's where folks tune in and watch nationally. You watch on TV, you can watch these national conventions. Now, that is where it's different at the state level, but when we used to rely on a convention system, you had delegates who were selected by the party that would attend these conventions, and they would decide the candidates that would represent the party in the general election. Now, last week I talked all about primary elections. And remember, the point of a political primary, the reason we have political primaries is so that it's no longer delegates deciding, right? It is the voters themselves. The voters get to say who is going to represent their party, and that's a major change. When I talk about the behaviors, and I spent some time on this last episode, right? A voter in a primary relative to a general election is going to be more ideological, right? They're going to naturally be more partisan. By definition, they're participating in a party primary. But if you want to say like, well, who's even more ideological, who's even more partisan than a primary voter, that's a delegate at a convention, right? It's next level of engagement, affiliation, and dedication. So when we switched from relying exclusively on conventions into then having primaries, I discussed crossover voting in the last episode and open primaries, but you see maybe like a little bit of diluting in terms of ideological strength between what you would see in a delegation at a convention versus a primary. I want to also add that when we're talking about these conventions and the delegations, they really are large pep rallies. Now, not to say that's all they are, but they are getting people together at the state level conventions. Like in Indiana, we have these conventions that happen over a weekend. They're going to be in one of the major cities in the state, but they rotate just as they do at the national level. And over the weekend, you'll hear from, again, up and comers, rising stars. You'll hear from the party strongholds. They'll vote about what's going to be the party platform, and we'll talk about some candidates here in a second. But it is a very big pep rally. You're getting excited. You're introducing the candidates that won in the primaries, and you're getting, I like to think of it as like you're getting ready, right, to kick off into the general election. I think sequentially when we're talking about these conventions, and this is true at a state level where you still have a convention system, and of course you have the primaries, but this is true at a national level with the convention system, right? The sequence, the order of election season is primary election, your convention, and then your general election. The convention is an important intermediary piece between the primary and the general. Now, you're listening here to Positively Politics on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Lara Marerfield-Wilson. We're talking about the conventional and unconventional conventions at the state level and the national level. What do conventions do? How do they serve us? Historically, what role do they play? And what's their value now? It's really what I want to talk about. So I mentioned these are glorified pep rallies. And I want to tell you, there are 3 states, I noted Indiana, but also Michigan and South Dakota, where the state law actually does include the selection of some nominations of candidates for office. And so this is one of those little asterisks where in these 3 states, Indiana, Michigan, and South Dakota, you actually have candidates being nominated in addition to your, I don't want to say glorified, but it really is a pep rally of sorts, right? In addition to bringing the delegates together, in addition to voting on things like the platform, which is crucial, but oftentimes not widely known to individuals beyond the political party, right? In those 3 states, they are also selecting candidates. Now, this is separate from their primary systems because all 3 of these states do have a primary system, but these are different offices. So when we're looking in terms of Indiana, you have the lieutenant governor, secretary of state, state treasurer, state auditor, attorney general. These are all the candidates for the party selected at the conventions. And you have your respective conventions. They are separate. They're 2 separate parties. Believe me, they do not overlap here. But you have those offices. For Michigan, fairly similar here, but you're talking about lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general. That's different. Supreme Court. That's different. Boards of the public universities for Michigan State, Wayne State, and the University of Michigan, and then the State Board of Education. So already when you're looking at the difference between Indiana and Michigan, and these are 2 out of 3 of the states in which the law requires the parties to nominate candidates for certain statewide offices, I'm going to tell you, the law is giving a lot more power to those Michigan political parties. Now let's talk about the 3rd state, and that's South Dakota. Right now, these are going to look similar, almost identical to Indiana's. That's your lieutenant governor, attorney general. That one is in there too. Secretary of state, state auditor, state treasurer. Then you have the commissioner for school and public lands and the public utilities commissioner. Not necessarily very powerful positions as far as statewide elected office goes, but a little bit more power just in terms of the number of offices you have relative to Indiana. And again, if we're saying like how powerful are political parties, this is a good metric. This is a great way to measure them because already you can say, well, these 3 states that give their parties convention power to select statewide candidates for office, meaning these are not candidates that are selected by voters in the primary. They will be selected, the ultimate office holder will be selected in the general election. But these are places, these are 3 states in which the parties have the power to decide who these candidates are. That tells you right there that the parties have a significant amount of power in this particular part of the process. Now, there are also states like Alabama, South Carolina, and Virginia, where you have your major political parties. So we're talking about Democrats and Republicans, and they can nominate candidates for the statewide office without having a primary for those races, right? So that is something that the parties can do. Now, I want to note that these 3 states and the parties are not choosing to do that. They haven't opted to do that this year. And then yet another difference in terms of state is looking at Virginia. Now, Virginia is really interesting because Virginia in recent election cycles has been seen as a swing state. Right? It wasn't one that we highlighted as much, I think, in 2024, but we looked at it pretty closely in 2020. They had gubernatorial elections this last year, 2025. They're one of the few states, all right, I'm looking at you, New Jersey and Virginia, that elects their governor in off cycles, so not a presidential, not a congressional midterm. They don't want to have any of that nationalized influence. But Virginia is really interesting. So in Virginia's government, under the state law, right, the party officials have the right to decide how a nomination will be made. That means they could decide if they want to have a caucus, which is very similar to a primary, right? Or if they want to nominate candidates through a convention. It gives the state party the decision-making responsibility. So does that give the party a lot of power? Your answer is yes, absolutely. You're listening here to Positively Politics on WICR or wherever you listen to your podcast. I'm Dr. Lara Marerfield-Wilson, talking today about conventional and unconventional conventions. What do they do? What role do they serve in American politics? And what I'm highlighting right now for you, which is something I think is fascinating. If you listen to the show a lot, you know I like doing this. It's the statewide differences. Because there is no one size fits all. And I highlighted some of the states in which you still have nominees being selected in conventions, or in which you can if the state so opts and choose so. Now, I want to add something in terms of this contrast between the primary elections and conventions. Because as you recall from the last episode I did, primary elections are giving voters the say in terms of who's going to represent their party in the general election. Conventions give the delegates. Delegates are often ironically elected. And I say ironically because it's kind of funny that you'd have an election to select the delegates who then make decisions versus just having an election, a primary election. But the delegates are going to be more ideological, right? They're oftentimes more engaged. By nature, they are very partisan compared to your primary voter, who will still be more ideological and more engaged and more partisan than your general election voter. But we do have 6 states that actually have political parties creating a process of state or local parties directly nominating candidates for the primary ballot, right? So that essentially forgoes what we call like requiring petition signatures, right? Minimizing the importance of filing in order to formally declare your candidacy. Now, that's just 6 states. Most states, and I know you can do the math, we got 50, so you knew it was 44 states, require candidates to file, which means they have to complete paperwork with either the state officials or the party officials to be able to qualify, right? Typically, this includes a small filing fee. When I say small, I want you to know it's in relative terms, right? It averages, give or take, about $500, $1,000. It does depend on the state. It also depends on the race. And you might say, oh, wow, you have a really high sense of what small is. Don't get me wrong. I don't consider $500 in a normal life context to be small. Like if I lost $500 or if I found $500, I wouldn't be like, ooh, I lost/found a small amount of money. I would never think that. I am cheap. $5 for me is a small amount of money. And even then I'd be really upset if I lost it and excited if I found it. But considering what you need to do in filing compared to what you do to run for office, and I'm thinking about the primary elections here, right? $500 is nothing. Campaigns are incredibly expensive. Competitive campaigns, meaning you have someone you're running against, are incredibly expensive. Open seats, where they are the most competitive, are incredibly expensive. The larger the district, the more constituents, right? The more expensive. The more urbanized area, the more expensive. The medium market, the more expensive. You get the idea. Higher voter turnout, more expensive, right? Lots of ways that these races will cost you far more than your little filing fee of $500 or $1,000. In addition, and I'm talking about what states have to do if you don't have a convention system where you are going to file and run for office. In those 44 states, in addition to paying that fee, right, oftentimes you have a certain number of signatures. So eligible voters have to sign saying like, yes, they support your candidacy. They aren't, interestingly enough, held to voting for you. Remember, we utilize the Australian ballot in this country. We have since the 1890s. And the Australian ballot is a state-prepared ballot that is uniform dimensions and size, no special color, no weird little ink perforations, anything that would designate if you have a Republican or a Democratic ballot. So in the general election, nobody knows how you vote unless you tell them. It is a secretive ballot. Now in the primary, they absolutely can know because as we talked about last week, we have open and closed primaries and not everyone participates in a primary. In some states, as I mentioned, like in Indiana, though we have a semi-open primary, you can take the ballot of your choosing. That is going to be seen as tantamount to your identification with a political party. Now, I want to add one more fun thing here because I talked a couple weeks ago about endorsements, and I love endorsements. I think they're so rich. There's some objective measures and statements we can have about endorsements, right? Like they absolutely can measure. They can matter in an election. They matter more if people know and like the individual giving the endorsement. They matter more in local and nonpartisan elections where people really need help making decisions versus in a national like presidential election where you already know the candidates. You don't need to know who endorses them. You know if you like or hate them, right? So those are some steadfast, objective measurements, statements we can make about endorsements. But one thing I want to add here that I think is interesting as we talk about conventions and primaries, focused on conventions, of course, today, is actually in two states, and this is Connecticut and Rhode Island, two I don't call out very often. The political parties have the ability to endorse a candidate before the primary, and that's going to be designated on the primary ballot. Wait, what now? That runs counter to what we believe in endorsements and then operates as a quasi-convention, a sort of nudge, if you will. I think of it as like a seal of good housekeeping, right? The seal of approval. So in a convention, you remember the delegates are going to select the candidates. And so you are, by virtue of the convention, it's the party selecting who they want to represent the party. In the primary, theoretically, you do that, right? The party selects their nominees, but it's the party through the voters. And we can have crossover voting. We can have party rating, as we talked about last week. In Connecticut and Rhode Island, right, you will actually have a designation on the primary ballot that says if this candidate was endorsed by the party in the primary. And that provides a little bit of risk because it relates to something we used to have in the state of Indiana called slating. In Marion County, which is Indianapolis, and up in Lake County, which is the very northwest part of Indiana, the political parties at the county level would indicate their preferences. They would create a slate of preferred candidates for the primary, much like I'm talking about in Connecticut and Rhode Island, where you have these pre-primary endorsements from the party. Typically, you would not want to do that, right? And think about it for a hot second. Why wouldn't you as a party want to endorse a candidate before a primary? This is the difference. This is an essential difference between a primary election and a convention, right? The convention is the endorsement, right? By the delegates selecting the candidates, that is the party having endorsed. But in a primary, it's not the delegates selecting the candidates, it's the voters, right? And the party faithful, the party leadership, the party loyal, and people who are very involved in the party might say, you know what? This is the preferred candidate. These, you don't give a long list of reasons why, but this is the person we want. These are the reasons, whatever it might be. Voters may not agree with you, right? Voters may not read the slate. Voters may not care about the slate. Voters will see advertisements. Voters will think about who lives in their neighborhood. Voters are going to think about track record and experience, right? They may be single issue voters. They care about one particular thing. And that's it, right? It doesn't matter. So that's one of the dangers of slating and also what we see in terms of these pre-primary endorsements from political parties that you have in Connecticut and Rhode Island, but just another statewide difference that I find fascinating. Now, I'm Dr. Lara Marerfield-Wilson. You're listening here to Positively Politics, either on WICR 88.7 The Diamond, if you're in the central Indiana media market and listening here on Saturday, or wherever you get your podcast. We are now streaming on all the podcast apps, and you can catch this show and previous shows, future shows, once, of course, they're current. But all of this, of course, where you get podcasts. So we're talking today about conventional and unconventional conventions, the role of party conventions. Now, I focused a lot already on state parties, and I think state party conventions are fascinating in part because they happen in these years. This is a congressional midterm. And when we think about the national party conventions, as cool as they are, and do not get me wrong, they are COOL cool, they happen once every 4 years with the presidential, right? Now, the state party conventions will get eclipsed. Oftentimes, they're not followed very closely by the media. They're not followed by regular voters. Right? You're not going to have these things live streamed in the same way that you will the national convention. But as I noted, they operate in a couple different ways. I want to talk about national conventions because just as we're in a congressional midterm right now, we are only 2 years away from these national conventions. Now, at the state level, you often see in these conventions, they'll rotate location amongst the large cities in the state. And to be very clear, it's not because they play favorites for urban areas. Right? They're careful to rotate because they don't want to be in the same place every time. You want to speak to your constituencies. It's just like any good conference. You know, if you're at the very north part of the state one year, you're going to have to go back to the south. And the center part is very nice for many people, right? But if you live in the north, you'd love to have it in the north. You rotate. I want to tell you that that's true across the country for major national conventions. So we're talking about these presidential conventions. But they don't go everywhere all the time. And in fact, I was looking at the list. They've basically been in 20 different cities, give or take 20 different cities. By far, the city that has hosted these the most, curious if you're going to guess it, right? What city do you think has hosted the most number of conventions for presidential election cycles? Right? If you guess the largest media market in the country, which is New York, you'd be wrong. They're number 4. They've hosted 6, 5 for the Democrats, 1 convention for the Republicans, but it's actually Chicago who's hosted by far the most. And what's fascinating about Chicago, they've hosted 26 of these presidential election cycle national conventions for the political party. It's almost split almost perfectly between the Democratic and Republican parties. So they've hosted 12 Democratic national conventions and 14 Republican national conventions for a total of 26. No one else comes close. Baltimore's hosted 10, Philadelphia's hosted 8, New York's hosted 6, St. Louis, then San Francisco, and then it goes down to nearly, a single digit. I was disappointed to see that my home city of Indianapolis was not listed on here, but you are typically talking about very large cities. There are some notable exceptions there. Kansas City has been in there, but also you're talking about places that are important to the party themselves. In recent years, we've seen the Republican Party focus on swing states or states in which they are confidently red. And same is true, of course, for Democrats, where they're going to be looking at states that either are swing states they want to try to capture, so they're trying to get that excitement, informally campaigning just on their party, de facto for their party in terms of having a convention. Of course, you also have to have a strong apparatus. You have to have a strong infrastructure. There are a lot of those different components. When we're talking about a national party convention, though, this is far more elaborate, not just in terms of the infrastructure, planning, organization, and timing than a state convention, which might be a state convention's a simple weekend. We're talking about 2 days, right? The national conventions are often a full week. Sometimes you're talking Sunday through Thursday. You have your big headliners every night. Another important piece of the national convention is that there's stuff going on all the time. Now, most of these happen in the summer months. We're talking about July, August for national conventions. For state conventions, they can be earlier. The important thing, remember in terms of the sequence of an election cycle in a year, you've got the primaries. Before that, of course, you have filing, but you've got primaries, conventions, and then the general. right? So the convention has to be somewhere in between there, because in most states, the party primary is going to select the candidate. The convention is the rah-rah pep rally where we get excited. You may also be selecting some candidates depending on the positions, right? As the candidate who won the primary, you're going to rally support. You're going to introduce yourself. Maybe voters don't know entirely who you are. You're going to get them excited. You're going to talk about the party platform, and then you go on to the general election. Now, one thing I want to add here in terms of the timeline, because I'm just giving you a sequence, the order of events, but something that's been interesting in evolution we've seen over the last several decades is the length of election cycles. Now, the election itself hasn't changed that much. Now, I say hasn't changed that much. You might say, wait, we still have just one election day. We have election day. Many states utilize early voting options. So really, even the election itself, even voting itself is a season, not just a single day. But when I'm talking about the elongated season, I'm really focused on campaigns, right? And campaigns have gone far longer than they used to. Not just in terms of we're already talking about 2028 now and 2026, right? But also in terms of just the election year. It used to be that you would really kick off a general election not just after the convention, right, or after the primary, but after Labor Day. That was the informal start to the general election season. If you think about Labor Day as, right, sometime at the beginning of September, I think it's usually the first Monday, you've got the rest of September, the month of October, and then at best a week in November. So you're talking about essentially 2 months, 8 weeks, give or take, of general election. And doing anything for 8 weeks can be exhausting and tiring. But no, we don't just limit to 8 weeks now. If you're starting your general election after Labor Day, I'm very concerned for your candidacy, especially if it's an open seat, it's a competitive race, it's a very large district, right? There's a lot of variables here, but you're likely to be setting yourself up for failure. You're not going to start early enough because now campaigns start so early. And that's one of the things that's important with the convention. You don't kick off your campaign at a convention, right? A convention is a next stop. It's like that little pit stop before you have the general election. And it really tends to happen for the state ones earlier in the summer, so it's after the primary. For our national conventions, we're talking end of July, beginning of August. You'll notice they don't overlap. They don't want to compete, not in that way. They'll compete in the general in November. Don't you worry about it. But they want to make sure they have full airtime. They get complete national coverage. I always appreciate they'll have different themes. You'll have big speakers. You'll utilize celebrities, right? And seeing how the party positions itself gives you a great indicator of what they think is important going into the election, right? It'll give you a sense of what issues matter a lot. Are they focusing on social issues? Are they going to really hit home economic issues? Where do foreign affairs play into this? You're hopefully not leaning into that too much. Americans typically don't know or care as much about foreign affairs, but it could be a big foreign affairs year. I'm going to say I think 2026 will be. We're still in a presidential election cycle, right? You'll also see who are they using? Who are the most important pieces, the people that are speaking, and also themes, ideas, individuals that are invoked. Oftentimes, you'll hear Reagan and Lincoln and Kennedy and Roosevelt, individuals who are no longer with us, but were important presidents and are going to be used strategically with their identity and how people think back on them as iconic figures within their respective political parties. So these conventions can tell us a lot about where the party stands, what the party is prioritizing, and how they are trying to connect and resonate with voters. I think of conventions truly as this pep rally with so much more substance, but also a lot of style. And I think a really good convention, whether you're talking about the national conventions that happen over a span of several days that are these multi-million-dollar events with an incredible elaborate infrastructure and so much planning and organization, or a state party convention, which is everything on a much, much smaller scale. right? They are conveying preferences. They're responding to voters, but really trying to anticipate what voters want in response to what their delegates and the party leaders are identifying as important. And I think they give us a lot of clues and indicators as to what we need to focus on, what we should expect to see, what we are likely to emphasize in the general election, as they serve as that intermediary point, that intermediary event in the sequence between a primary and a general election. Right? Now, conventions oftentimes are quite conventional, but we have some years where they seem less important, some years where they seem to be vital and critical. I'm looking ahead to 2028 and thinking about the role the convention can play, the delegates, the voting for president, but more importantly, the decision in terms of vice president and how that might be incredibly critical in the 2028 general election for president. And I want to thank you for tuning in. You've listened here to Positively Politics. I have a new episode every week, whether catch it on where you get your podcast or WICR. I'm Dr. Lara Marerfield-Wilson.